Thank you all for joining us. We're just going to wait another 30 seconds or so. There we go. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is really very, very exciting. We're delighted to have Professor Kenneth Roth with us this evening. I think you read that he is a visiting professor at Princeton, at the Princeton School for Public and International Affairs, and senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. And prior to that, he served for nearly 3 decades as the executive director of Human Rights Watch. Last January 2023, Professor Roth's appointment to the Carr Center was blocked by the then Dean Elmendorf due to Professor Roth's criticism of Israel. At that point, MAPA, Mass Peace Action, participated in the effort calling for the appointment to go forward by sending 900 messages to the dean and to Harvard's general counsel. And we're delighted that his appointment went through. I follow Professor Roth on Twitter, and I'm always struck by his incisive tweets about human rights across the globe. But there were 2 things that I wanted to call out this evening because they're relevant to our conversation, which is that Israel has held an estimated 10,000 Palestinian children in military detention over the past 20 years, and as many as 800 children this year. They are the only children in the world who are systematically prosecuted in military courts. I mean, that's just a shameful statistic, right? And the other one is, in response to a post by an Israeli member of Knesset who suggests that the Palestinians in Gaza voluntarily immigrate to neighboring countries like Egypt, Mr. Roth said, it isn't voluntary. It's under Israel's bombardment and siege. And it isn't immigration because Israel isn't proposing to let anybody back into Gaza. So it's emigration, another Nakba. So with that said, Professor Roth is going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for your questions. Could you please refrain from using the chat while he's delivering the talk? Let's give him our utmost attention and not distract all of us as we're listening. So with that, welcome, Professor Roth.
Well, thanks very much for having me. And thank you very much for your support, I guess almost a year ago, when, because of my criticism of Israel, I was temporarily rejected for a human rights fellowship. But, it was really because of protests from people like you in the media, many people affiliated with Harvard, that the dean after about 2 weeks of outrage reversed himself. So I appreciate that. And it was, I think, an important statement of academic freedom, that one can criticize Israel and still, proceed with an academic appointment. Although, as I noted at the time, I had a certain visibility. I was able to kind of garner broad support, and many academics and students don't have that possibility. So they self-censor or they risk reprisals. But that, was a year ago now. And what I want to talk about this evening is the current conflict in Gaza. And in Q&A, I'm happy to go more broadly and discuss, other issues, but I'll start there. And I'm going to come at this conversation not from the perspective of being pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli, but rather from the perspective of being pro-civilian. And I'm going to explain what that means by applying the rules of international humanitarian law and try to analyze the conduct of both sides. Now, humanitarian law, is typically codified in the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the so-called Additional Protocols of 1977. And these are actually thick books, but their essence is pretty straightforward. And so I'm going to apply some of the key principles from that law to the conduct of both sides. And let me begin with October 7th, because Hamas's attack on Israel was just a blatant violation of the most basic provisions of humanitarian law. That is to say, to kill civilians, to rape women, to abduct people into Gaza, to fire indiscriminately into civilian populated areas. These are all blatant violations of humanitarian law. These are war crimes. And so, some people, try to say, oh, Hamas, they were justified in responding to the occupation or the apartheid. It's one thing to say they were justified in responding. It's quite another to say that they could commit war crimes. And the rules of humanitarian law prohibit certain conduct regardless of the justice of your cause. And so it doesn't frankly matter to me, why Hamas was acting, what it chose to do by killing, raping, abducting, firing indiscriminately. This is never permitted regardless of the justice of the cause. And so, these are blatant war crimes. Now, one basic principle of humanitarian law is that war crimes by one side never justify war crimes by the other. And it's easy to understand why that is, because, in war, emotions are high, accusations of war crimes are common. And if the mere perception or allegation that the other side committed war crimes meant that you could throw away the Geneva Conventions, there would be no more Geneva Conventions. And so we have to assess Israel's conduct in its own terms, not by comparison to Hamas. And, Israel says, oh, well, we had a right to defend ourselves. Fair enough. But again, just like Hamas, which, some would say has a right to oppose the occupation, just like Hamas has to abide by humanitarian law, so must Israel in defending itself. Now, there are certain basic provisions of humanitarian law that I'm going to run through right now. One which Israel likes to dwell upon is to say, we didn't deliberately kill civilians the way Hamas did. And I don't think we have evidence that Israel sort of set out to, deliberately kill civilians. But we do have some evidence that Israel has been targeting deliberately civilian structures without anything like a justification for these being military targets. And just to cite one example, Israel attacked the Islamic University of Gaza. And the justification that I've heard is, well, this was, a place where Hamas intelligence agents were trained. Now, I thought about that rationale. Harvard, I'm sure, over the years has trained many CIA agents. Does that make Harvard a legitimate military target? I don't think so. So you get a number of cases like this where Israel seems to be attacking what are known as, they call power centers, but institutions that are important to civilians, but have little, if any, military target. Or military value. Now, what Israel violates more commonly is first a rule against indiscriminate warfare. And what that means is that even if there are sort of a few military targets in the area, you're not allowed to treat the entire area as a target. You've got to focus on the particular military targets. But what we've seen is that, Israel has been decimating entire neighborhoods. And we're beginning to understand why. First, they've been using a large number of 2,000-pound bombs. These are huge bombs that, have massive destructive impact. But also what we now are discovering is that, even though in this era, everybody has precision-guided weapons, weapons that you can target very well to hit the intended site. Israel has been using about 40% of unguided classic dumb bombs, where you have to, fly the airplane at an angle or just drop it and calculate as best you can where it's going to land. And so, frankly, we shouldn't be surprised that these bombs are having an indiscriminate effect, that they're leveling broad neighborhoods. The US says it has not used dumb bombs in 20 years. This is just, gone with history because it is relatively cheap to even refashion dumb bombs with a precision guide. And Israel, for whatever reason, having to do with, I think, the amount of bombs that it dropped, its desire to save some precision weaponry for a possible fight with Hezbollah, has been resorting to dumb bombs. And so this is, a big reason why we have seen such indiscriminate damage throughout much of Gaza, with, huge percentages of the buildings being damaged or destroyed. Now, the issue that comes up probably most frequently is the rule that even in attacking a single military target, the attacker is not allowed to fire if the anticipated civilian harm will be disproportionate or excessive in relation to the anticipated concrete and direct military advantage. Now, this is, a bit of a judgment call, but we've seen a number of cases where Israel seems to be making a bad judgment, basically opting for firing despite quite clearly disproportionate harm to civilians. I mentioned these 2,000-pound bombs. One thing it did was it dropped 2,000-pound bombs in the middle of a refugee camp. Now, the US government will not drop 2,000-pound bombs in a populated area, it says. It won't drop 1,000-pound bombs. It's reluctant even to drop a 500-pound bomb because, as you can imagine, the explosive effect is enormous. And predictably, many civilians die if this is a populated area. But Israel dropped two 2,000-pound bombs in the Jabalia refugee camp. There are, various other examples where the harm clearly seems to be disproportionate. There have been a number of large kind of prestige apartment buildings that the Israelis have just tumbled to the ground. Typically there they give a warning, so people leave, but they destroy, 100 families' homes in a shot. And they always say, oh, there was some Hamas presence there. But they never even pretend that this was a serious enough military threat to justify this enormous civilian harm. Another example where we've seen this is with respect to the hospitals. Now, we've all heard Israel says, oh, Hamas, they have command centers under the hospitals. So far, there's been no evidence of that. What they've shown is, a handful of rifles, a tunnel here or there, but nothing approaching what would justify basically shutting down many of these hospitals. No immediate attacks from the hospitals. And so, the military advantage for closing these hospitals has been modest. Hamas has left for the most part. But the harm for Palestinian civilians has been huge because, in the middle of a war, as people are getting bombed, they get severely injured, they need a hospital. But at various points, more than half of Gaza's hospitals have not been functioning. And even those that do function, they lack things like anesthesia. So this is, a horrible situation. And it's not just for bomb injuries. Imagine a pregnant woman who suddenly can't deliver in a hospital, or, somebody who has diabetes and needs insulin treatment, or somebody who's getting cancer treatment. I mean, there are all kinds of just ordinary health needs that people have that are not being met because the Israeli government has basically shut down so many of these hospitals. So this again, demonstrates really a disproportionate impact on the civilian population. And when you, start looking at why this might be, you begin to recognize that senior military officials and civilian officials are sending the signal that Palestinian life isn't that important. And so when, the defense minister, Gallant, says, referring to the people of Gaza, these are just human animals, that's a basic invitation for war crimes. That's to say, these lives don't really count that much. Or when Netanyahu himself invokes this biblical verse, Amalek, in which there's a divine injunction to kill every man, woman, child, and animal, what kind of signal does that send? If you're a soldier and you see the top officials saying, these are not really civilians, go shoot away, you get, predictable discounting of the value of Palestinian civilian lives. And we saw, a recent example of this with the tragic killing of the 3 Israeli hostages who were, had no shirts on, so they clearly were not wearing suicide vests, and they were waving a white flag, and they were just shot. Now, why was this? I mean, the soldiers, may have said, oh, we feared we were going to be attacked, but there was no evidence that they were being attacked. And it seemed to be more just a view that you have a young man there, you shoot him, and we don't know exactly what they were thinking. But again, it's indicative of this devaluing of Palestinian civilian life that has led to so many disproportionate attacks. Now, let me just run through kind of a few other elements of humanitarian law before opening up to your questions. One is one that I think we've all read a lot about, that humanitarian law requires that the warring parties grant civilians who are in need access to humanitarian aid. And as we all know, Israel has been doing this reluctantly and only in drips and drabs. That before October 7th, roughly 500 trucks were entering Gaza every single day. Since then, if it goes up to 100 in a given day, that's a lot. Many times, hardly anything's coming through. And in the meantime, Israel has, shut off the water, shut off the electricity, and lets in just, bits and pieces of food, of medicine, of fuel for generators and the like. And so this is, becoming severe deprivation. We all probably saw the videos that came out this morning of, desperate Palestinians just jumping all over the handful of aid trucks that were coming in. They were so hungry, they were just desperate to get the food. And so we also, I think, are facing the possibility of a real public health crisis, because the lack of electricity means sanitation services are minimal. The lack of fresh water means people are drinking whatever they can. And you can imagine how this is, just an invitation to cholera or various other infectious diseases. Now, let me say two words about what Israel has been saying in its defense. One is it's been saying, you've all heard this, human shields. Hamas is using human shields as if it's all Hamas's fault. Now, it's true that Hamas sometimes does use human shields. Sometimes it also fires from populated areas, endangering the population. These both are war crimes. But as I say, war crimes by one side don't justify war crimes by the other. And there's a duty on the attacker, even in the case of a human shield, to fire only if the harm to civilians is not going to be disproportionate to the military advantage. And so the citation of human shields doesn't really justify Israel's apparent repeated indifference to Palestinian civilian life. Now, the other thing Israel says is, we've been giving warnings. And it's true they have. There's a requirement under humanitarian law that if possible, an effective advanced warning be given before an attack. But Israel has been giving these warnings in a pretty inhumane way. So first of all, as you all remember, they basically told everybody in northern Gaza to go south, even as they continued for a while bombing the route to the south, even as they continued bombing in the south. Then they said, finally, move from one area of the south to the other. We're going to fight in Khan Yunis, the big city there, move closer to the Egyptian border. And so gradually, Palestinians, 2.2 million people, are being squeezed into this postage stamp of territory near the Egyptian border. And so there are various problems with this. One is that people don't feel safe anyplace. Second, as I mentioned, the humanitarian aid, the ability to receive all these people is utterly inadequate. And what many people fear is that Israel is really pursuing an agenda that certain government officials have articulated explicitly, which is to say they want to render Gaza inhabitable and gradually push people into Egypt. Now, Egypt doesn't want this because, it's a poor country. It doesn't want to take on 2 million people. It's worried that with the civilians would come Hamas, and Egypt already has an insurgency in the northern Sinai. But more to the point, Egypt doesn't want to be complicit in another Nakba. That is to say, another, as Palestinians say, catastrophe, a reference to 1948, when 700,000 Palestinians were forced from their homes and never allowed to return. Indeed, some 70% of the population of Gaza are the descendants of those 1948 refugees. So, the people of Gaza don't want to leave their homes. and Egypt doesn't want to be a party to another forced displacement. So that's kind of roughly where we stand at this stage. Many people have rightly been horrified at the extent of the destruction. And we have to sort of ask, so, what is the plan here? What is Netanyahu trying to do? And he seems, he says, oh, I want to destroy Hamas. It's not clear what that means. Hamas is obviously much more than just a group of soldiers. It's also a political movement. It's gained popularity because of the intensity of the Israeli bombardment. And is it possible, even militarily, to destroy Hamas without destroying Gaza, without having massive civilian costs? And I think we need to ask, are there other ways that Netanyahu can secure Israel without this extraordinary disruption? And, there was some progress initially with the hostages for prisoner exchanges. Those have come to an end for now. But it certainly is possible to envision a deal in which, the hostages get exchanged for some number of prisoners. The surviving leadership of Hamas goes to Qatar, kind of similar to what the PLO leadership did in 1982 when they went from Beirut to Tunis. That there be ways to ensure that this military leadership is not in place without further decimation of Gaza. But Netanyahu seems uninterested in that. He clearly has a conflict of interest here. He, knows that as soon as the fighting stops, a commission of inquiry begins into who was responsible for the intelligence failure of October 7th. He knows that if he loses his prime ministership, the corruption trial picks up again, and he could find himself in prison. So he has, incentives, political incentives, personal incentives to continue this fighting beyond what most people feel is called for in the quest to guarantee Israel's security and to punish the people who have been responsible for the horrible October 7th attacks. So let me stop there with that kind of brief overview, and I'd be very happy to take your questions and answer them as best as I can.
Super. Thank you so much, Ken. Folks, we're going to open it up for Q&A. To the extent that we can get people to ask their question verbally, we'll do that. But if we get too many questions, we're going to have you post your question in chat. So if you have a question now that you'd like to put in chat, go ahead. And otherwise, raise your your Zoom hand. Ken, could I start with a question? Sure. There's a relationship between, I think these laws were created for deterrence purposes. And you correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea here is to set a body of law and to say, you must follow these laws. And then there's an enforcement arm. But if there's no enforcement, then the deterrence kind of doesn't work. Could you speak to that?
No, I mean, Abby, you're right. First, just if I could say something about this law. Some people are sort of dismissive of it, saying, oh, this is too pie in the sky. Netanyahu has suggested he's not even going to follow it. He keeps citing, World War II examples when there was large-scale killing of civilians, pretending not to know that the Geneva Conventions were meant to sort of set higher standards and reject the indiscriminate bombardment of World War II. So these are standards that, were not drafted by human rights groups. They were not drafted by peaceniks. They were drafted by the world's militaries. And they were designed to be, feasible, the best way to fight a war, not only because it's more efficient to, target the other side's militaries and not hit their civilians, but also obviously because it's more humane. So these are standards that everybody, including Israel, subscribes to in theory. Now, as you note, law is only as good as it's enforced. And one of the problems, until relatively recently, is that most enforcement was left for each military. There have been obviously exceptions. There were the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals. There were the country-specific tribunals set up for the former Yugoslavia, for Rwanda, for Sierra Leone, Cambodia. But for the most part, there was no real international tribunal until 20 years ago, the International Criminal Court came around. And the ICC does have jurisdiction over what's happening in Palestine. I use the term Palestine because it has this jurisdiction through the fact that the UN General Assembly recognized Palestine as a non-member observer state, and that status enabled Palestine to join the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and to refer the situation in Palestine to the ICC. And so what that means is the ICC has jurisdiction over any war crime committed by a Palestinian national and any war crime committed on Palestinian territory. And so even though Israel has never joined the ICC, any crime it commits on Palestinian territory, that is in Gaza or the West Bank, it can be prosecuted for. Now, there has been an open investigation approved by a judicial panel that has been in place now since March 2021. The current prosecutor, Carr, a British barrister, took over in June 2021. And I think it's safe to say that he did virtually nothing until October 7th. At best, he was slow walking the investigation. And he was doing this because this was a sensitive investigation. You may remember that Trump actually imposed sanctions on the prior ICC prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, because she had the audacity to, one, open this Palestinian investigation, but second, to open investigation in Afghanistan, which could have implicated US torture in Afghanistan. And so he froze her bank account and restricted her, suddenly her credit cards didn't work. Karim Khan is aware of this. Now, Biden, to his credit, lifted those sanctions when he took office. And there is, strong pressure on Khan to move. Shortly after October 7th, he went to the northern Sinai, to Rafah, and held a press conference there and kind of very eloquently spoke about what he needed to do. But nothing happened. There's been no evidence of an actual investigation. He then, a week or two later, actually visited some of the communities in southern Israel that had been where Hamas had attacked. He went to Ramallah and met with Palestinian leaders. Again, kind of nice talk, but nothing's happened. So we have to see what's next. He clearly is under enormous pressure to act, and he should address abuses by both sides. Hamas October 7th attack, as I mentioned, these are easy war crimes to prosecute. So, I would expect at some stage for those, some people being charged with those. It doesn't, the ICC doesn't charge governments, it charges people. On the Israeli side, the easiest crime to have prosecuted all this time was the settlements, because the settlements are violations of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibit an occupying power from transferring its population to occupied territory. And so, every Israeli government, but certainly Netanyahu with his massive settlement expansion program, is subject to war crimes charges. But, Khan has got to bring these charges. He's got to analyze the bombing in Gaza. So I presume he's doing this now. But, these kind of investigations are done secretly, so we don't know what's happening. But it is, I think, very important for these to go forward, because otherwise we're just left with Israel investigating itself. And there's a long history of that rarely producing anything.
Right. Super. Thank you so much, Ken. Sophia, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
We have to make.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So my question is around your first point that you made in the beginning of the meeting around Hamas and how they don't have the right to, that their actions aren't justified because they are people who are living under occupation. I'm wondering if you can clarify that. There are a lot of people who say that because Palestinians are living under occupation and the UN has given them the right to resist that occupation through armed struggle, that somehow their actions are justified. And so I'm wondering if you can just speak a little bit more to that. Yeah.
Sure. No, if you accept that there's, a right to resist the occupation, that right would exist in the form of the ability to attack the military on the other side. So to fire at Israeli military bases, to fire at Israeli soldiers, combatant and combatant. That's what war is supposed to be. It does not give Hamas the right to target civilians, to go to a music festival and just randomly kill people, to abduct civilians randomly from kibbutzim, to rape women. I mean, none of this is justified by the right to resist an occupation.
Thank you. Jeffrey, can you give us a short question? And unmute yourself, Jeffrey.
Yeah. What you said, all that stuff. I got a lot of ideas for what I could have, for solutions for that can actually help end this crisis. But I don't want to turn this into the Jeffrey show, and that's kind of a good. So first off, I do think you could share your contact with me so I could talk to you about that, talk about that with you one on one.
Jeffrey,
secondly,
do you have a question for Mr. Roth?
I was getting to that. And secondly, I don't call those two countries Israel or Palestine. Instead, I want to prefer by calling it a new name, which I prefer, which is called the Holy Land. I'm proposing a Holy Land reunification. My question is, what do you think of the idea of the Holy Land reunification when eventually the two countries come together for peace and cooperation, like almost like the Korean reunifications based off that.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Most people still think that the two-state solution is the best solution. But I think that they recognize that Israeli governments for many years, and the Netanyahu government very intensively, had been undermining any possibility of a two-state solution. If you go to the West Bank and sort of go on a hilltop, what you see is, between the settlements and the outposts and the bypass roads, that, the small little areas where the Palestinians still enjoy a degree of self-rule are tiny little bantustans. I heard one number that it's divided into 169 different areas. It's like Swiss cheese. And that there is, no possibility of a viable contiguous state. And that's, what this settlement expansion enterprise has yielded, which is why many Israelis today refer to a one-state reality. And if there is a one-state reality, then there really are two options. Do you give equal rights to everybody within that one state, which obviously many Israelis don't want because they would lose their Jewish majority. It would be about 50-50. Or do you live in apartheid, which is what it currently is in the occupied territory, because there are two blatantly different legal regimes for Israelis and for Palestinians, complete with many of the other attributes of apartheid, including the settler-only roads and the varying restrictions on whether you can expand your house or where you can travel and the like, many of which have no security justification whatsoever. So that's those are the bad choices in a sense within this one-state reality. To move back to a two-state solution would require some real sacrifices on the Israeli side. It would mean you would need to have a government that could stand up to the settler movement, because a significant number of those settlements either would have to be dismantled or transferred to Palestinian Authority. And obviously Israelis could still live there, but they would have to live under Palestinian rule, hopefully with rights. So that's kind of the difficult situation that Netanyahu and his predecessor governments have led us to. I would love to see the two-state solution be revived. Clearly, October 7th has shown that this idea of just kind of kicking the can endlessly down the road and assuming that the Palestinians can become reconciled to an endless occupation, that's, a pipe dream. That's not reality. So there is much new talk about a two-state solution, but we haven't seen, governments on either side, Israel or Palestine, that would have the credibility needed to make some of the sacrifices that would make a two-state solution possible.
Super. I do see the hands up. I think I want to take one I'm going to go between the chat and the verbal. So the next one, Ken, is, does the Israeli assault on Gaza rise to the level of genocide?
This has been a big topic, and let me just first explain what genocide is, because genocide is not just a term one throws around. There's a legal definition to it. There's a treaty. And what it involves is, certain conduct, including killing, done with a very specific intent, an intent to eradicate in whole or in part a racial, religious, national, or ethnic group as such. Now, the level of killing in Gaza is high enough to meet that part of the requirement. More people have been killed in Gaza than have been killed in other situations that have been called genocides. So it really comes down to whether that intent is there. And, there are certain senior officials who have spoken in genocidal terms. I mentioned, Gallon's human animals comment. I mentioned Netanyahu's invocation of this biblical injunction to kill all the men, women, children, and animals. Those will be cited as evidence of genocidal intent. There then are a bunch of Israeli generals who say, no, we're doing everything we can to spare civilians. That will be, that kind of balance of competing statements will be what ultimately is looked at in deciding whether genocidal intent is the dominant force or not. I should say, though, that this is, in my view, a bit of a sideshow. There's a tendency to treat, crimes as not really serious unless you call them genocide. And genocide's a way of saying, this is really bad. But in fact, what we have is clear, large-scale war crimes, which is awful. It's plenty for the International Criminal Court to proceed. So I'm a little wary of kind of venturing down too far in the genocide conversation because it tends to diminish the severity of the crimes that are being committed without this kind of legal debate.
Thank you. Joan, do you want to unmute?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah, go ahead.
But now we can. Now you muted yourself again, so start over.
There.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Okay. So this morning, the Secretary General was proposing that they have another that the UN Security Council put another vote on the floor. And I was wondering if you'd comment about, because there could still be another veto by the US. And I was wondering if you could comment about Chapter 6 of the Charter, which is called the Peaceful Resolution of Disputes. How could that possibly be used in this case?
Well, okay. I think you're, first we all know that the US vetoed the last effort to insist on a humanitarian ceasefire. And, this is part of the Biden administration's, essentially playing defense for Netanyahu. On the one hand, Biden keeps saying, let in more humanitarian aid, kill fewer civilians, be more careful. But they are, in a sense, giving the green light to Netanyahu as he proceeds with his massive bombing campaign. And, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, was just in Jerusalem or in Israel and was saying things like, we want this kind of wrapped up by the end of the year. But Netanyahu comes back and says, no, it's going to be more like February. And so, at some point you got to say, well, what's the US government going to do? They have enormous leverage. They could, as you know, just not veto a Security Council resolution. They could not sell further arms, or they could condition additional arms sales on them not being used in Gaza. We all know that they give $3.8 billion annually in military aid. There's another $14 billion that is being proposed that's now wrapped up with the Ukraine bill. These are all sources of leverage that Biden seems unwilling to use. Now, in terms of the Security Council, I don't think it matters that much, Chapter 6 or Chapter 7. The
Chapter 6, I meant.
Yeah, well, Chapter 7 is the coercive chapter. Chapter 6 is for non-coercive tools, but it's sort of doesn't matter because nobody's going to be sending in the troops even under Chapter 7. The whole point of a Security Council resolution would be to kind of build up the pressure on Israel to stop. That was also the effort of the General Assembly last week, which was won overwhelmingly. which again, like Chapter 6 of the UN Security Council, the General Assembly does not have coercive powers. This was meant as, hortatory moral pressure to get Israel to stop. So far, Israel has been resisting that. And when push comes to shove, I think what really matters is Washington. Is Washington really twist Netanyahu's arms, using the leverage it has, or is it going to sort of, talk a good game and saying, be more careful, but in fact not do anything to stop the killing? And it comes down to Biden.
Thank you. John, Ostfield, do you want to unmute? John, unmute.
Got it. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to make a really quick comment, and then I have a question. I have believed that we had the two-state solution for about 50 years. We had the state of Tel Aviv and the state of the settlers. And after this last election in Israel, the state of the settlers annexed the state of Tel Aviv and is treating the area within the Green Line the same way that they treated Palestinians on the West Bank. You've seen that with the shutting down of demonstrations and everything. Demonstrations for ceasefire or anything like that since October 7th. And the other thing I'd like you to comment on, because it is such a terrible irony. You've got people like Raphael Lemkin invented the term genocide. You had lots of people who worked alongside Eleanor Roosevelt in crafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then the post-World War II treaties about human rights. And so many of these people were Jews, and now we see
John,
happening.
can you get to the question, please?
Would you comment on that? The irony of that.
Very good. Thank you, John.
All right. Well, John, I do think that broadly speaking, there were two lessons drawn from the Holocaust. And I say this, I'm myself Jewish. My father grew up under the Nazis, fled to New York in July 1938. So I kind of grew up with Hitler stories, and I'm very aware of what happened. There are, some Jews who, as you note, took a human rights lesson. They said that, Jews were slaughtered in the Holocaust because the human rights norms against that were weak. There are others, which you could sort of say is more the Netanyahu line, said Jews were slaughtered in the Holocaust because Jews were weak. And therefore we need to build this, strong state. And there's an element of truth in both of those. I mean, I think, Israel clearly needs a strong defense. And Israel is, part of the protection for Jews around the world. But to have just the strength without the human rights norms is, I think, just taking half the lesson of the Holocaust, and actually is jeopardizing Jews around the world. Because obviously, more than half the Jews in the world didn't go to Israel. They live like I do in the United States. And if the Netanyahu government says all that matters is that we're strong and we're going to throw out the rule book with respect to human rights, that's bad for Jews around the world. It's actually bad for Israel, as we've seen, because it makes it more likely that you get attacks like Hamas's on October 7th, because if Israel's not going to pay attention to the rules, why should Hamas? And so I do think that we should reinforce both lessons from the Holocaust. Yes, of course you need a strong Israel, but you also need strong human rights norms, so that whether it's the attack of October 7th or the surge of anti-Semitism or what have you, that those kinds of violations of human rights are also become unthinkable.
Okay. Ken, there might be a discussion at a later point about whether, in fact, the state of Israel makes Jews around the world safer. We can discuss that.
Yeah.
But let me go to some other questions here. So there's a question about what kind of power does the world have to stop the Israeli occupation from moving forward with its apparent goal to build settlements in Gaza, which we've heard a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense that, Biden has been saying, no settlements in Gaza, no seizing of Gazan territory, no forced displacement. Is he going to stick with that? I don't know. He's also saying, stop bombing civilians, and that's being ignored. But if Israel were to build settlements in Gaza, that would be a war crime, just like the settlements in the West Bank. This is, as I mentioned, one of the easiest crimes for Karim Khan, the ICC prosecutor, to pursue, because he doesn't have to piece apart, who was firing at whom or what was where in the middle of the battle. He can just, look at the obvious facts on the ground. So I would hope that he acts on this, but we just don't know. But if you say, what are the big restraints on Israel, it would be, the U.S. foremost, because of its enormous leverage from its military aid, its arms sales, and just the political defense it provides of Israel. Nobody wants to be prosecuted, nobody wants to be charged by the ICC. Life becomes very difficult at that stage. Ask Vladimir Putin. So that's another source of significant leverage. And even if the ICC doesn't act, it's worth noting that various governments exercising what's known as universal jurisdiction could pursue these cases in their national courts. Germany has been the foremost users of universal jurisdiction. They would probably be the last ones to prosecute Israeli officials. They've been horrible in trying to hold Israel to account. Although I do note that the foreign minister, who's kind of on the more progressive side of the government, did at least push for a sustainable ceasefire in an op-ed, I guess, over the weekend with her British counterpart. So, there's modest movement in Germany. But these are the sorts of tools that are available. None of them are foolproof, but most of them are not really yet being exercised.
Yeah, good. Greg, do you want to unmute? Greg Dennis?
Thank you. Sorry, didn't let me unmute to start. I'm sorry if I missed this because I arrived a bit late. Israel's asserted a right of self-defense under Article 51, but my understanding was that Article 51 doesn't afford an occupying power right of self-defense against people it's occupying. So Israel would have a right to a police force to restore order, but not necessarily a right to respond militarily. I think that was also the assessment of the UN Special Rapporteur. What do you make of that assessment?
I've heard this argument. I think it's completely wrong, because it's like people have never heard of a civil war. Just imagine a civil war. You don't even need to think of an occupation, but just, a country where there's a rebel force. You're allowed to fight back. Not necessarily just using police powers. You're allowed to fight back army to army, combatant to combatant when it's a war. And there is a basic question: does this rise to the level of an armed conflict? But once it is an armed conflict, you get to assert the right to self-defense. You get to fight like a military, not just as a police force. So I just think these are people who kind of get caught in some, kind of technical analysis of law, and they lose track of reality. Of course, Israel can respond militarily to a military attack.
Okay. Maureen, is that how to pronounce your name? Unmute there.
Yeah, good enough. So my question is about what kind of training, if any, a military is required to provide to its soldiers so that they know what the principles of humanitarian law are, or laws of war are. And if they do things that are violation or war crimes or violations, can they individually be prosecuted, or only the command level can be prosecuted?
The quick answer is, the individual soldiers can be prosecuted. As a practical matter, it's going to be up to the national authority to do that, because the International Criminal Court is only going to look at the commanders. But to come to the beginning of your question, the commanders do have a responsibility to educate soldiers. It's not enough to just sign the treaty and hope that somebody reads it. You actually have a duty to instruct people. And Israel, does have a bunch of smart military lawyers who are supposed to be guiding these decisions. Soldiers are trained. But, the scary part is just, the hidden messages when you get somebody like the defense minister saying these are all human animals. It's as if, yeah, those are the, that's what the books say, but this is a serious threat. Just do what you have to do. And so I'm worried that there's too much of that, indifference to Palestinian civilian life that's being communicated from the top that is tending to override the very strict requirements of humanitarian law.
But do you know whether they do actually get training? Because I saw a video today, made about 3 days ago, 3 or 4 days ago, by an Israeli soldier in the 2014 war. And he said that, I mean, this may or may not be true, but he said that he went in there and he had absolutely no idea about anything to do with the laws of war.
I'd be surprised if that was true. I mean, I think most modern militaries train their soldiers, and I'd be, surprised if Israel didn't. I don't know for a fact that every soldier gets trained, but they certainly are supposed to get trained.
Okay, thank you.
So Ken, I think this is going to be our last question because we have an action to ask people to take, excuse me, at the end. There's a question in the chat. Can you comment on the suit brought by the Center for Constitutional Rights in California on behalf of Palestinian human rights organizations and individuals against Biden, Blinken, and Austin for complicity in Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what court is ever going to get involved in this. So I kind of see that suit as more of a political statement than something that's likely to be pursued. But maybe I can answer the question a little bit differently because once there is recognition that Israel is committing war crimes, and Biden said so much. He said this has been indiscriminate bombing. He didn't use the term war crime, but he may as well have. It's the same thing, and he did that twice. Once that knowledge is there, then continuing to provide arms to a military that is committing those war crimes leaves the sender subject to possible prosecution for aiding and abetting war crimes. And this is not just a theoretical matter. There was an internationally backed tribunal for Sierra Leone, which convicted the former president of Liberia, Charles Taylor, of aiding and abetting war crimes in Sierra Leone because he provided arms to this awful rebel group known as the Revolutionary United Front, whose signature atrocity was to chop off people's limbs. And the court found that, you knew what they were doing and you continued to send them arms, you're guilty of aiding and abetting these atrocities. Now, Biden and other senior US officials, under the exact same theory, could be held liable for aiding and abetting war crimes. Do I think, Kareem Khan, with his sensitivity to the feelings of Washington and London, is going to do that? No. But as a technical legal matter, that certainly could be the case.
Super. So Ken, I want you to turn on your gallery view so you can see everybody thanking you for your talk. Everyone, could you please wave your hands and in appreciation of Ken's talk, please?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And folks, don't leave yet because we have an action we'd like you to take. I'm putting it here in the chat. So as you know, we are demanding a ceasefire and we want the US to call for a ceasefire. And the US is also trying to give $14 billion of our tax money to Israel. And we say no to that. And we'd like you to sign on to that. So if you go to the link that I put in the chat and you'll see this action and then put in your name below, which is we're asking our members of Congress to support Congresswoman Cori Bush's Ceasefire Now resolution to oppose the funding of Israeli war crimes with the $14 billion that are being proposed to send to Israel and to call for an immediate ceasefire. Cole, is there anything you want to add to that?
I think you said it, Abby, but just takes a minute. Go ahead and fill in that form and you will send 3 messages. 2 to the US senators from your state. That will be Warren and Markey if you live in Massachusetts, and 1 to your House representative.
Is it Marinette? Do you want to, is that a new question, Marinette? Marine, I'm not sure what the pronunciation. Unmute, please. Unmute.
They can't unmute unless we let them, Abby.
Can you unmute now? Go ahead.
I forgot to lower my hand after the last comment. I wasn't trying to talk again.
Okay. Jeffrey, we're not going to be able to share Ken's email address here. We'll respond to you after this session. So Cole, I think we're done. Do you agree?
Yes, we are. I could just add that MAPPA has a Gaza-Israel peace campaign. If you live in Massachusetts, join our campaign. We have committees organized in each congressional district that are trying to pressure their representative to agitate for a ceasefire and against the military aid. So join